So thank you and good morning once again. Our fourth and last session of the day is the interplay between protection of civilians and strategic communications, to be moderated by ASG Martha Pobi. ASG Martha Pobi is currently the Assistant Secretary General for Africa in the Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations. She has served for over 30 years in international affairs and diplomacy with Ghana's foreign ministry. She has previously served as an ambassador and permanent representative of Ghana to the United Nations from 2015 to 2020. In that position, she was chair of the African Group of Ambassadors in New York, Vice President of the 71st session of the United Nations General Assembly, Chair of the New York Group of Friends of the African Women Leaders Network, co-facilitator of the high-level meeting on financing for development, and co-chair of the Group of Friends on Gender Parity at the United Nations, among others. Ms. Pobi previously served as Deputy Head of Mission and Charge d'Affaires at the Ghana High Commission in Pretoria, Director of the Information and Public Affairs Bureau at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Head of Chancery at the Ghana Embassy in Washington, D.C. She was also Acting Director of the Bureau for Human Resources and Administration for Information, Culture, and Linguistics. She served as the Minister Counselor and Deputy Head of Mission at the Ghana Embassy in Tel Aviv, and as Charge d'Affaires in the same embassy. Ms. Pobi also served as Acting Director of the Personnel and Training Bureau from 1998 to 2000. She also worked as Permanent Mission to the Office of the United Nations in Geneva, 1995 to 1998, and the Embassy in Moscow, where she was First Secretary. Ms. Pobi holds a master's degree in development studies with specialization in women and development from the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. She also has diploma in public administration and multilateral diplomacy from the Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration and the Geneva Institute of International Studies. That's a very big CV. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our distinguished panel.
Thank you very much. I did not expect that long introduction. I guess many of you now would guess my age. It's been a long time in the Foreign Service. But I'm really pleased again, once more, to have the opportunity to play this role in moderating our fourth and last panel, which I think is an opportunity for us to tie together the different strands of our discussions these couple of days. Having looked at the evolving context, we delved into the protection of civilians this morning, an excellent panel discussion also on StratComs, and now we're looking at the interplay between the protection of civilians and strategic communications. It has been very clear from the various presentations and exchanges in the last two panel sessions that both protection of civilians and strategic communications must complement each other. Our moderator in the last session rightly indicated at the start that strategic communications cannot compensate for operational shortcomings in the implementation of POC mandates. Indeed, actions speak louder than words. Positive perceptions about a mission will be shaped by successes in its mandate implementation, and in the context of our meeting, in successes in the implementation of the POC mandate. But also, StratComs does play an important role through timely, transparent, and humble communications in shaping the perceptions about the UN, particularly in moments when we do not do so well, failures that we, from time to time, experience. Effective protection of civilians also enables the mission's ability to establish trust, gain credibility, and counter mis and disinformation. Community engagement, as we've heard, carried out by both uniformed and civilian components, is central to POC efforts, as missions can enhance their capacity to protect civilians by fostering trust and acquiring valuable information that contributes to the creation of a protective environment. In parallel, effective strategic communications also enhances awareness of how civilians may be protected by peacekeepers and manages perceptions on any shortcomings in mission performance vis-à-vis POC. Furthermore, public information tools available can help to promote respect for peace, human rights, and reconciliation while discouraging any acts of violence against civilians or against UN presence. We've also heard earlier yesterday the current context, the threats of mis and disinformation that necessitates a very comprehensive approach that integrates POC plans at all levels and uses various means to reach out to targeted audiences. Strategic communications are really at the heart of dialogue and engagement, which foresees targeted outreach, communication, and exchange with key stakeholders who can influence POC outcomes in any given setting, including the host state and the institutions at national and local level, non-state armed actors, and community representatives and civil society actors. Now, this is my attempt to try to pull certain all these thoughts and expressions that have come from around all the participants as a way of introducing the next steps in this event. Now, this session, as I said, is going to try to draw all these strands together in the two priority themes. The questions that we hope our panelists will be addressing, and we look forward to hearing their contributions in that sense, how POC and Stratcom can work effectively together in a peacekeeping context. We would also like them to try to help us understand how Stratcom can mobilize and affect the intentions, perceptions, and expectations of all relevant actors to enhance the protection of civilians. What are the tools and the structures that the missions can use? How do we improve Stratcom and engagement with local populations to strengthen the understanding of the peacekeeping missions and their mandates? A key question that I hope to also hear from them is how local communities can be better engaged and consulted about POC to improve the effectiveness of peacekeeping missions. What are the dedicated capacities, training, and expertise that are needed to help mainstream POC messaging in Stratcom? And what are the new technologies, and how can these be leveraged to support Stratcom for POC and address misinformation and disinformation and hate speech? Now, to help us unpack all of this, we have three panelists. The first is Police Inspector General Krishnamurthy, who has been the head of the International Relations Division of the Indonesia National Police since 2022. In addition to many other senior positions in his National Police Service, he has experience serving in UN missions, including in UNAMID in 2008 to 2009. He also served as a police planning officer in the police division of the Department of Peace Operations from 2011 to 2013. May I invite Police Inspector Murthy to join us. The second panelist is Lisa Sharland, She is a senior fellow and director of the Protecting Civilians in Conflict program at Stimson. Lisa was previously the Deputy Director of Defense Strategy and National Strategy at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Australia. Her research has focused on UN peace operations reform, peacekeeping effectiveness, protection of civilians and women, peace and security. Lisa served as a defense policy advisor at the Permanent Mission of Australia to the UN in New York from 2009 to 2014. Lisa, can you join us? Third, but certainly not the least, is Colonel Major Shakib Rais. He has been the head of Contingents and External Operations Division at J3 General Headquarters for 7 years. He has command experience at the battalion and brigade level. He comes from Morocco. He has been deployed to KFOR and UNOCHI and served as military advisor to the SRSG-1 for ANSMIS, Syria, for 4 years. He's also currently pursuing a PhD in conflict resolution at Mohammed VI University in Rabat. Can you join us at the podium? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Panelists, Madam Pobi, distinguished participants. I think it's still morning. I would like to greet you in Rwandan language. Muara Mutse. I'm very honored to be here today, to be a panelist on the issue of the POC-Strategic communication interplay. Before continuing delivering the paper that was drafted by the Indonesian government, we take into serious this conference. So before leaving from Jakarta, we had several meetings on how we can giving inputs on this conference. So that's why I cannot only share my thoughts, but the text that I'm going to read is drafted by the government of Indonesia, as we know that Indonesia, for this conference as a host, co-host with Rwanda, UK, and Netherlands, and also we have been relentlessly taking part with the UN mission since 1977. So it's very important for us to provide inputs in regard with the strategic communication, interplay on POC, where the inputs can be addressed to UN, United Nations, to PCC, TCC, and other stakeholders like UN country team and those who are running the missions on the ground. Mandated by our constitutions, Indonesia, as I already told you, that has been relentlessly taking part in the United Nations peacekeeping operation since 1977. Reflecting from our experiences in peacekeeping mission, Indonesia would like to offer a perspective on how protection of civilians in strategic communication should be seen as something that is mutually supportive instead of mutually exclusive. The success of implementing the protection of civilian mandate must be supported by an active and inclusive communication that will help peacekeepers earn the trust from the host government and local communities. The interplay of effective protection of civilian and strategic communication should start from the missions. The active participation of all elements involved in the peacekeeping operation, ranging from mission management to peacekeepers at the front line. It is important to pertinent points, engagement, and connection. I emphasize that there is 2 pertinent points, which is from our government's release, the co-engagement and connection between or among those who are on the ground or in the missions. Those engagement and connection, we believe, can enhance the ability of the United Nations in achieving its mandate is by enhancing enhancing communication among the entities in the missions with the host country, all parties involved in the conflict, and the local communities which seeks for peace. Nevertheless, the communication itself will never be achieved unless we are able to build the engagement and connection with the stakeholders as mentioned above. In this regard, let us emphasize 3 key strategies on how to achieve the end. First, establish strong communication strategy that involve all parties in mission area, from decision makers in New York to our blue helmets on the ground. Second, foster strong communication line between the mission and host government as well as local communities. Third, reiterate peacekeepers' role in protecting civilians, delivering humanitarian assistance, and safeguarding peace agreement. Should it be decided by the mission's principle, or can we involve more components to provide inputs? Given the dynamic nature of peacekeeping operation, it is imperative we involve other components in communication mechanism to ensure our proposals meet the needs from the ground. One of them is through encouraging representatives from the ground to provide extensive report on what has been happening to help decision makers in New York better identify the mission's needs and concerns. This multi-way communication method will help us have a thorough understanding of all stakeholders' characteristics. Second, should be the communication method be more substantive rather than just a symbolic posture. While our blue helmets presence symbolizes our commitment in restoring peace, we should optimize their presence by increasing their engagements with civilians. One of them is through involvement in community and public activities, such as helping local communities in road reparations and providing protection during beat matches. Third, what is the right communication tools? To get our messages across, we must use the right media, symbol, and key message. Instead of focusing on traditional tools, such as mail or meetings, we should also look for alternatives, including by increasing our public presence in key public events. Fourth, what is the role of peacekeepers? Are they problem solvers, transitioners, or focus on solely in assisting the host government? It is important to have a flexible approach in interpreting the mandate, particularly in identifying ways on how we can better support to the host government and local communities. As we have seen in several cases, some of our troops are unable to help the local communities because it is not regulated under the mandate, such as rigid approach can limit the mission's effectiveness in providing support for the host countries. Finally, should the strategic communication be limited only to digital communication or also to include physical presences? Based on our previous elaborations, I would suggest that the strategic communications also includes physical presence of our peacekeepers on the ground to the neighborhood. When we are talking about strategic communication, we must understand 7 elements that are essentials to successful communication. First, the communicator or the actor. The communicator is the person or the entities or institutions who is trying to get their message across to the persons or other institutions. In this context, the communicator ranges from all entities in UNPKO or DPA, from the decision makers in New York to the peacekeepers on the ground. Second, the communicant who receives the message. The ability of the communicant to process and understand the message may depend on their educational background or experiences. Therefore, it is important for the communicator to understand that the communicant's background to decide the best communication way to get their message across. In this context, the recipients varies from all entities in UNPKO to host government, conflicting parties, and local communities. To ensure effective communication with various stakeholders in the receiving states, it is important to tailor our message in accordance to the communicant's background. Third, the message itself. The message can be the form of word or body language, or even the event. An effective message is one where there is congruency between words, meaning, and emotion. Hence, a thorough understanding of the communicant can help the communicator craft the message according to their background. Fourth, the channel used by the communicator to send the message to the communicant. It can be in the form of persons, telephone, mails, or other channel, even the event or the presence of the peacekeepers on the ground. The communicator must be able to determine the channel to be used based on the nature of the message to be communicated. Critical or sensitive messages may require in-person communication. For effective communication with various stakeholders in the host state, it is advisable that communicators use in-person method to earn their trust. In addition, it is important to note that several communities still face difficulty in accessing information. The use of radio or conventional communication means such as poster may help the communicator to send their message. Fifth, the noise, that they may distract both communicator and communicant. The noise may come from internal such as thought and emotion, or from external such as the other conversation or other noise. It is important for both communicator and communicant to reduce the distraction and refocus. Six, the feedback. In this process of determining if the message is properly received, in order to ensure that the communicator gets the message across, the communicator may ask the communicant to confirm whether the message is already understood. One of the examples is by conducting survey or informal discussion with the local communities to hear their feedbacks. Seven, the context. It is very important to understand the context when and where the communication takes place, such as the state of mind of the communicant, the last contact with the communicant, and the other factors that should be taken into consideration, such as cultural background. Therefore, it is imperative for the United Nations PKO to understand the local culture of the host state. In view of the above, it is advisable that all entities in UNPKO understand these elements to ensure good communication. A success strategic communication should go hand in hand with an effective and strong implementation of protection of civilian mandate. It is important to ensure the communities who we are committed to protect feel safe and secure. Our ability to do so will increase their resiliency. The question is, how can we make them feel safe and secure? We can start from ensuring their basic needs are met, such as protecting their access to water, to food, education, and shelter to increase our presence in the mission area. However, several setbacks remain in delivering protection of civilian mandate to the local communities. We have witnessed the armed groups and other stakeholders interfere UN operation by shaping perception of the political landscape, undermining confidence in mission, and mobilizing violence against United Nations personnel and other targets within the mission. Moreover, the changing technological landscape is further complicating peace operation. This is where protection of civilians coincides with strategic communication. As the need for a safe and secure environment arises, Local communities will put higher expectations from United Nations peacekeepers to provide a safe and secure environment. While we are addressing the aforementioned challenges to implement the protection of civilians mandate, it is important we have an effective strategic communication to manage our communities and host government expectations toward our mission, which can be done through the 3 strategies we have outlined earlier. To conclude my session, let me raise 3 points as follows. First, we have to minimize the gap between UN rhetoric and actions. Mission mandates should be smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, and mission should be fully equipped according to mandates and be prepared to go for extra mile. Second, we should optimize and evaluate the existing mechanism from headquarters up to the smallest unit on the field to access cross-cutting issues within the mission, in particular those related with protection of civilians. Third, we have to encourage training for peacekeepers in related with protection of civilian and strategic communication, as well as consultation mechanism on both topics within mission structures. Ladies and gentlemen, panelists, Madam Pobe, this is not just a mission. It is a grand adventure. It is about making a real impact, create lasting peace, and safeguarding the safety of our peacekeepers. I thank you. Ura Beha.
You took us through the 7 principles of effective communication, and also made the linkages between those and where they actually intersect with the protection of civilians, stressing the need for physical engagement, not just use of technology in messaging. So all of that really very key, and thank you really for sharing this and the engagement of the government of Indonesia, and even in preparing this paper for our consideration. Thank you. So I'd like to move on now to Lisa to give her presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you, distinguished guests, our hosts, the Rwandan government, and the co-hosts of today's preparatory meeting, Ms. Pobe, for the introduction. I'll try and keep my comments brief because I think this is such an important topic for us to be discussing at the moment. As has been mentioned by a few speakers already here over the last day and a half, next year will mark 25 years since UN peacekeeping missions deployed with the protection of civilians mandate from the Security Council. And as we sort of approach, I guess, another period of introspection in terms of what peacekeeping has achieved and where it has learned from some of its challenges, in this broader conversation of strategic communications, I think it's really important that collectively we look back in terms of what has been achieved when it comes to the ability of peacekeeping missions to protect civilians, what has been learned. And in particular, I'd point out that evolution that we've seen, many of the tools that we have available today, whether it be training, policy, guidance, all these things that have started to filter down into different troop and police contributing countries, and the way that peacekeeping is undertaken is a huge marker of success of what has been achieved over the last 25 years, without any disrespect to some of the challenges and limitations and failures that we've seen in particular settings in certain missions. Layer onto that, I think the complexity that we currently see has been laid out by many speakers in terms of peacekeeping today, the challenges with the operating environments, the role of spoilers or belligerents, the challenging relationships and pushback from different host authorities, and then layer in the conversation we just had in the panel before us around mis and disinformation. And you have a very complex environment that we're looking at in terms of the strategic communications and its interplay with protection of civilians. And this is something that is central to a lot of the work that we do at the Stimson Centre in terms of our program, and one of the reasons that we're looking at this particular topic as relates to the role of disinformation in UN peacekeeping at present. So So with that in mind, I want to touch upon three things broadly in terms of my comments today. The first one, and this has been alluded to and I think addressed in many ways across the last day and a half, is why does strategic communications matter in the context of POC? And we've heard from the introduction to this conversation today, we've heard just from the presentation there that it has a pivotal role in terms of not only the relationships that are formed with different stakeholders that are engaged in peacekeeping, but I would also contend in terms of how peacekeeping missions are able to respond effectively to the different threat environments that they encounter today, particularly as relates to protection of civilians. We heard in the previous panel that mandates are often complex and poorly understood, even for the missions that are tasked with their implementation. And so I think this is a really key challenge when it comes to protection of civilians for peacekeeping missions, is how to communicate what has been agreed to in the Security Council in an environment at present where there may not be unanimity within the Council, and that is creating another challenge for peacekeeping missions as well in terms of the implementation of mandates, but communicating what can be done when it comes to protection of civilians, and also importantly what can't be done in terms of strategic communications. And so we see this sort of playing out at the moment in the context of MONUSCO, for instance, the conversation around the transition process. And as the mission sort of withdraws from different parts of the country, what does protection look like as the host authority step up in terms of the responsibility and their primary responsibility to protect civilians? So putting in place effective strategic communications plans and strategies across the mission are essential to managing expectations and building trust. We know that missions work with limited capabilities and resources to deliver on their mandates, and it's imperative that a number of these limitations are communicated to manage expectations throughout the life cycle of the mission. And another point that I think we've heard was raised in terms of drawing these links between strategic communications and protection of civilians is the requirements may differ at different periods within the mission. We heard in the previous panel, for instance, the reference to the crisis response that's required in terms of strategic communications and how that has ramped up. And we see in mission context, for instance, that at various points, perhaps in elections, for instance, there might be a spike in terms of some of the concerns or threats to particular groups, in terms of the risks that they will face in those communities. You may have, for instance, the evolution at the moment of the role of mis and disinformation in the context of elections that may have a gender dimension. And so all these things come into the considerations around the role that peacekeeping missions have when it comes to protection of civilians and ensuring that there isn't a vacuum that can be filled by other actors in bringing in this information. The second point that I wanted to go to briefly and is in terms of the target audience in relation to the strategic communications. And I think there's two dimensions that I want to reflect upon. One is the role of the mission in terms of engaging with different stakeholders and communicating what it is doing when it comes to protection of civilians. And the other is at the more strategic political level, perhaps sort of that communication sort of from the, for lack of a better term, but sort of from bottom up or from the field to headquarters in the Security Council, which I think is quite an important dimension as relates to the conversation we're having around POC. But to go back to the first point in terms of the target audience, I want to focus on two in particular, because I think these are really critical themes that have emerged out of our conversations. The first is local and affected communities, and the second is national or host authorities. Now, I want to acknowledge first that there are many other audiences that it is critical in terms of communicating with by the peacekeeping mission. And I will point to the fact that the Protection of Civilians Handbook that anyone has looked at, that the Department of Peace Operations and many other parts of the Secretariat and missions have put a lot of effort into, includes a substantive analysis, I think, of a number of these different stakeholders in relation to strategic communication. So there's quite a lot of groundwork that has been done there in terms of the mission context. But to go back to sort of the point there, I want to start with the local and affected communities. And we've heard directly from our colleague in Bentiu in South Sudan, in particular over the last day and a half, about some of the challenges that are faced there for the communities that are relying on the mission in many ways to provide and afford that protection, but also in terms of how they work with the mission in building and upon the capacities that are already there for their own protection as well. So I think pivotal to this is understanding the protection needs and mechanisms that local communities already have in place and supporting and building upon them. And to go to the specifics, what are some of the resources and mechanisms and missions that we already have that we know are essential to this? The role of civil affairs, the role of women protection advisors. We've seen the impact that joint protection teams have had and patrols by uniformed components. And we saw all this reflected in a presidential statement by the Security Council last year that really drew that link out when it comes to strategic communications and protection of civilians at the local level, and acknowledging the importance of investing from the outset in dialogue and engagement with local actors, particularly women and youth, in order to build from the bottom up a protective environment for civilians. So we've had all this laid out at that strategic level. But there are two particular dimensions into this that I want to highlight. The first is the importance of two-way communication, and this is a theme that we've seen, that this is not just a one-way communication from the mission to those that are affected and that have risk to their own safety and security as well. So in some instances, it may be about communicating a longer-term strategy by the mission when it comes to protection and supporting capacity building. And we had this conversation yesterday around the role of POC sites, for instance, and what that looks like in the longer term in terms of a transition process, for example. But it's also about communicating where the government and host authorities have responsibility as relates to protection of civilians. Similarly, in that two-way communication, it is essential to ensure that there is diverse representation engaged in those processes and that you have representation from groups who are affected differently by conflict and that have different protection needs. Some of the research that we've been engaged in at Stimson has been around this topic of host country consent. And the reason that we framed it as host country consent rather than host state or host government was part of an effort to explore this relationship between the mission and local communities that they work with and their support for a mission's deployment. As we know that a lack of local support may be exploited by belligerents or spoilers, and we've had this conversation around mis and disinformation, or utilised by host authorities to undermine cooperation with the peacekeeping mission. But one of the findings of the research that we did was the importance of mechanisms for host communities to provide feedback on mission activities and perceptions through different forums for the exchange of independent, and one mechanism that we looked at, for instance, was the importance of independent perception surveys, which we know there is increasing work being done looking at how this can provide a feedback loop into missions in terms of the work that they do. And indeed, the other challenge in relation to local communities that I'll briefly touch upon, and I think one we need to be cognizant of as we have a discussion around the role of different actors deploying alongside the UN and the conversation around different ad hoc security initiatives, for instance, is the communication about the mission's role as it relates to protection of civilians in that context of partnerships. From some of the discussions and research done in MINUSMA a couple of years back, we found that there was a real misunderstanding amongst different actors around what the role of the UN peacekeeping mission was when it came to protection of civilians and what the role of other entities were that were deployed. And so in an environment, or the likelihood that there are going to be more actors operating in different environments, as we see in Eastern DRC at the moment, it makes it more imperative that there is that engagement at the local level around the role of the UN peacekeeping mission when it comes to protection of civilians in this increasingly complex partnership landscape. And to the other target audience that I mentioned, the national and host authorities, and we've had several conversations on that over the last day and a half or so. We found from some of the research that we did around this topic that the role of senior mission leadership can be quite critical in setting the tone of that relationship, particularly as relates to the host government's responsibilities. So it's imperative that there is a proactive level of engagement that is taking place there as well. And I should note there, of course, that is a mission-wide responsibility as well. That does not fall entirely to senior mission leadership by any means, but that can have quite a pivotal influence on sort of the outcome and shape of that relationship. But to the point that I think has been raised, and we heard this yesterday by the Unmissed Force Commander, for instance, I think another point that has really highlighted one of the tensions that we have in some peacekeeping mission settings at different points in time is the importance of protection of civilians in contexts where it may be government security forces or proxies that are engaged in the threats to the civilians. And this is one of the tensions in terms of what we see with strategic communications around the role of the mission and the responsibilities of the host government, and sort of that relationship as well of managing the consent that exists there. And in some instances, you know, it may depend on who the message is coming from in terms of relaying what those challenges are, but there is undoubtedly an important role for senior mission leadership in that relationship with the host government. So very finally, I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to wrap up on sort of looking at that other broader audience as relates to strategic communication and protection of civilians in the context of the ministerial that we have coming up in a few weeks. And here I want to highlight sort of 3 dimensions. The first is the importance of the role of the UN Secretariat with the support and encouragement and engagement of member states, troop and police contributing countries, host authorities, in communicating what peacekeeping is and isn't, and the role of protection of civilians in that context. And as we approach the 25th anniversary of protection of civilians in the context of UN peacekeeping, this is a really important conversation that needs to be taking place to collectively reinforce the important role that peacekeeping missions perform in protecting civilians. There is a risk that this is perhaps no longer necessarily a shared view in some contexts, and we have seen some pushback. I bring up the example of the mission in Mali, for instance, from different host authorities around the role of protection, expectations around whether a peacekeeping mission should have a protection of civilians mandate, regardless, or I think contrary perhaps to some of the needs of civilians on the ground. So I think this is a very important conversation that brings in this broader perhaps concept of communicating around what peacekeeping is doing and its links to protection of civilians. The second point there ahead of the ministerial is, the role here of troop and police contributing countries in not only supporting that messaging and engaging in that discussion, but in terms of their messaging around why countries contribute to UN peacekeeping. In 2015, we had the adoption of the Kigali Principles on protection of civilians, and in the forthcoming ministerial, there are a series of pledges that relate to responses of strategic communications and mis and disinformation around training and capacity building, deploying different capacities within mission, deploying personnel who might have experience in public information roles, or even more broadly in the role of open source data intelligence or information, and a whole host of other range of resources. And similarly, support to opinion and media surveys and a whole host of things. So I think there's a really comprehensive list there that would address some of the points that have been raised over the last day and a half that are really important, I think, to the future ability of peacekeeping missions to strengthen their efforts on protection of civilians. And so the final point that I'll conclude on, and it's more of a question, but I think this is the longer term conversation around what peacekeeping missions do as relates to strategic communications and the interplay with POC. And that is, how do peacekeeping missions build capacity and work with partners to support resilience in an information contested environment to protect civilians? This is not just about what peacekeeping missions can deliver to support those efforts. It's also about how do you build that resilience, and this was a point made in the previous panel as well, within the community to understand the different types of information that are being presented, to respond to them, to ensure that you have a vibrant media and that you have different capacities to support that. And I think that's a longer term challenge in building that protective environment for civilians, both while a peacekeeping mission is deployed and after they depart and transition as well. So I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that very interesting presentation, focusing on managing expectations, building trust in terms of our also communications with the local communities, with the national authorities in this. And I particularly like the 3 areas that you touched on, looking ahead to the ministerial. And that involves not just the Secretariat, but I think also for TCCs in the messaging, why we contribute to peacekeeping context, and also the point about building resilience within the building protective environment, resilience within the communities, how they respond to misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and so on. So really looking forward in how to the ministerial and beyond in the longer term vision in mind. So thank you very much for that. I would now turn to our final panelist for this session, and that is Colonel Major Shakib Rais. You have the floor.
Excellencies, Generals, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol respected. First, I would like to thank all the countries organizing this conference, namely Rwanda, the host country, Indonesia, United Kingdom, and Netherlands, who have honored us with the invitation to attend this ministerial preparatory meeting, the last one before the ministerial in Ghana. Today, I have the honor of leading a presentation on countering disinformation and protection of civilians in peace operations. I have to say that Morocco, drawing on its long experience in peace operations, guided by the Enlightenment vision of His Majesty the King, Supreme Chief and Chief of General Staff of the Royal Armed Forces, it is particularly interested in this concern, especially as the Royal Armed Forces deploys contingents and experts in several missions since 1960. In view of the many upheavals caused by disinformation and its far-reaching impact, I propose to address the issue according to the following agenda. State and non-state actors can disseminate disinformation that can affect a wide range of fundamental rights, undermine public policies, responses, or amplify tensions in times of emergency or conflicts. This phenomenon has a negative repercussion at various levels on the credibility of the UN as international organization, its missions deployed, and most on the host countries. In extreme cases, can even trigger serious humanitarian crisis or even wars. Generally, disinformation trends are in a constant evolution driven by the generalization of new technologies and repercussion of geopolitical mutations. In today's world, it is primarily characterized by the trends as shown in this slide. Given this complex and dynamic situation, international organizations, including the UN and multiple countries, are developing strategies to monitor and to counter the spread of false information. The major challenge in this effort is to combat the phenomenon without undermining freedom of expression, a fundamental of human rights. The Secretary General has submitted a report to the General Assembly in which he describes these challenges and the responses required, including on the awareness raising and the training. He also launched an initiative to mobilize member states to contribute to the development of a strategic and operational framework based on accumulated experience and best practices. And Morocco contributes to this initiative by 2 experts. In parallel and in line with UN strategy, Morocco, as an all-troop contributing country, has set up certain measures to combat disinformation. Based on their experience, the Moroccan Royal Armed Forces contribute to this effort by the following 4 areas that I will develop shortly in the next coming slides. The first one, indeed, based on feedback and experience, the Kingdom attached considerable importance to raising awareness of its personnel concerning the phenomenon, including throughout the sensitization on the importance of the prevention measures and constant training and training of trainers on the subject. Community communication is carried out through vertical and horizontal ways. In fact, contingent trained personnel disseminate information on the action undertaken by the mission and our contingents during official meeting with local and during interaction during the mixed patrol or engagement teams. Coordination with the Force HQ to refute dissemination against UN or to destabilization of the country. Customs and practices are an essential aspect for the local communities. Aware of the specificities, Royal Armed Forces pays particular attention to the respect of the environment in their areas of deployment, encouraging the learning of local languages by personnel to be deployed, and apply zero tolerance on the execution of the rule of engagement and the rule of behaviors. Another significant aspect of the measures set up by Morocco concerns CIMIC activities, which are geared toward local population and cover a wide range of activities. We are convinced of the importance of the integration in the environment of deployment, focusing on human protection, continuity, respect, help to reinforce the ecosystem with dignity. I can give you many examples on that, and we agree on that with my sister from South Sudan this morning. Our Royal Armed Forces experts panel and seasoned academics finished reviewing a draft manual on combating disinformation. This manual will be used nationally as a pedagogical reference with training centers to reinforce the preparation of peacekeepers. And after translation in English, it will be sent to UN for sharing or for use as a preventive and palliative, with the palliative recommendations in this regard. And here I am proposing few recommendations taken from the document for consideration. At the first one, at the strategic level, there are three important recommendations to consider. The first one is the involvement of the host countries and the development, adoption, and implementation of UN strategy to counter disinformation. Strengthen the mission communication capacities and resources. Include in the mandates and resolutions and other documents inclusive communication strategies. At the informational level, it will be useful to strengthen the communication skills of peacekeepers in the use of various social networks, establish relations based on trust and transparency with local media, emphasize information monitoring at the mission level to detect trends and plan actions and content adapted to each mission. At structural and organizational level, it is proposed to appoint focal points to combat disinformation, create crisis cells in response to a disinformation campaign, reinforce force communication cells with qualified personnel. The information shared should not give false hope or promises to locals. We will evaluate it because they will evaluate the results after a few months and weeks. On the adoption of language approach, it is important to ensure multilingual media coverage of the mission and contingent action for the benefit of local population. Strengthen strategic communication and the provision of credible content, particularly in coordination with local authorities. In the area of training and awareness raising, it is recommended to increase the awareness and training of the peacekeepers on disinformation, including information, evaluation and verification skills in training program, and reinforcing the pre-deployment and induction courses on the subject. Also, cooperation and coordination are very important on the subjects between all missions components and within other agencies. Establishment of cooperation and information exchange mechanism to share analysis, best practices, and lessons learned, and to develop a proactive communication strategies to counter misinformation and disinformation in the mission. The last recommendation is to adopt a financial strategy capable of meeting the needs of any action taken at the headquarter level, at the mission level, and also at the contingent level. Those measures can be discussed and recommended in the next CUE 2026. To conclude, Morocco, throughout its peacekeepers, will continue supports effort to counter disinformation in peacekeeping, and we will share, as I said, the manual recently elaborated with UN authorities in English and French for training or other purpose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colonel Major Rais, for that presentation, sharing with us the model that Morocco has followed and the major recommendations you're making going forward. I think that I would just touch what hit me a lot, respecting local communities, trying to build relationships with them, areas that we could support the communities, from health to water, resources, even firefighting. And then to thank you for the handbook that you have, which you're ready to share with us. I think that is a key tool that the headquarters would welcome, and more so in the different languages that you intend to translate them into. So thank you. I think you've emphasized and underlined a lot of the issues that have already been touched on, capacity building in various areas, particularly of our troops. The appointment of focal points was very useful in that regard, and the creation of crisis cells, which I think we've also heard mentioned in the room in the past 1.5 days. So thank you very much. And so now that we're done with the panel, I think it's time to have our Q&A. We have, I believe, a lot of time. This time we only have 3 panelists, so I hope that we can get a very interactive discussion going forward on this last panel discussion. I already see 2 hands on the side, so the one with the microphone, the mobile one, yes, I see the nice lady approaching.
Okay, I'm Khilji from Pakistan. First of all, my compliments to the team and to the members. They have presented a very nice presentation, which made us understand for the coming pledges at Accra. My question to the panel would be, what you are looking, both the panelists or all of you recommended the on-ground presence of troops as well for the fighting the misinformation and disinformation. So my question would be whether the composition of the team should be from the existing troops deployed over there, or you are looking at a specialist team which can understand, which can go for the reporting, which can evaluate the information, and then they can come up with a plan or with the fighting back the misinformation or disinformation. I thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Moderator, AICUN, panelists, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. This is Babu Ram Adhikari, Joint Secretary in Ministry of Defense, Government of Nepal. So I am looking after international coordination and peacekeeping in the ministry. First of all, I would like to congratulate Government of Rwanda and then other co-hosting governments for successfully hosting these very important events. So of course, United Nations is always in the center. I also would like to extend congratulations to UN team for their effective coordination for this event. So we have been benefited from different perspectives for 1.5 days. So regarding this strategic communication and POC, I think POC is a in, and then strategic communication is a means to achieve the protection of civilian. Strategic communication is one of the means. It's not all, because we also heard yesterday that this is not the panacea for everything. This is one of the component or one of the strategy for POC. It is to be supplemented by other strategies as well. So what I would like to add on is we have heard a different perspective on presentation. We also had a chance to listen to first-hand experiences from the mission as well. So regarding these strategic communication and POC relations, maybe we need to think from 2-3 other aspects as well. Government of Nepal is very keen on increasing the language competency for the peacekeepers. So recently we have decided to establish a language lab in the peacekeeping centers. The focus is the peacekeepers to be deployed in different missions. They should have some local language competencies, which could be very useful for effective communication. I'm very happy to share at the moment that Nepal is the second largest troop contributing country, and then number 1 is in female peacekeepers. And the second aspect is, I think this, from the mission also, female peacekeepers are more effective compared to male peacekeepers in terms of getting engaged with local communities. So Government of Nepal is committed with the Secretary General's this policy of increasing the number of female peacekeepers. So I think this can also be looked into. And we have also heard something about this information gap. If there is no information to fill in, definitely there is room for misinformation and information. But at the same time, we also need to think of frequency of the information. For example, if we just share any information on the part of the mission once or twice, it may not be that effective. Perhaps if we can increase the frequency of the information, that may help to tackle the misinformation and disinformation, because these misinformation and disinformation are often louder, and the louder voices are often heard. So maybe if we can see these things on that perspective also, it can be a little useful. We are eagerly waiting to visit all of you, most of you in the Accra, and the Government of Nepal is working now to regarding these pledges, and the part of the pledges will be definitely this effective communication. Thank you.
My name is Major General Silva Kayemba from Uganda. Madam Moderator, I'm looking at a situation where we've been saying that protection of civilians is a primary role of the host nation. And I want to agree with you, but also disagree. You must bear in mind that by the time you deploy a mission where you give a mandate of protection of civilians, then the host nation has either been overwhelmed or it has failed. We have to pick it from there. 2, if that is the case, I would like to look at this preparatory meeting in relation to the ministerial conference and approach it this way. How do we operationalize this discussion of protection of civilian and strategic communication in view of the expectations of pledges of troops, equipment, services, and perhaps institutions? If that is the case, I would look at it this way, and I beg you to correct me if I go wrong. We have realized that if you pledge a unit to go into any mission, please be prepared for a challenge of communication as you protect the civilians. And I want to divide this. 1, on the military side. When you talk of strategic communication from the military angle, you are talking of high-level communication. How are you going to protect civilians? What equipment are you going to deploy to be able to detect and deter? Because you need to observe, monitor, and engage. In all these, you need to communicate. As you observe, as you monitor, as you deter, so that you can carry out what yesterday I called missions that are preemptive to the negative forces, as you protect the civilians. If you have this communication equipment, then you also need integrated training, because you are going to use either land, air, or water components in this one operation. So you need strategic communication as you do this. This is for the military. But as you do that within your contingent and other contingents, you are also going to receive information from the civilians themselves that there is this imminent attack. How do you establish that communication? What equipment do you need to work with them? This is where you find you need human int to work with community-based organizations, the civil societies, the NGOs, and your other contacts. But what equipment do you need as you do this? This is for the military in that mission, where you are pledging. But let's look also at the other side, and I would address it more solely to the moderator. When we are giving a mandate to a mission, there are tasks. And tasks are made according to the way the mission is constituted. It's only UNIFIL that I've seen where a head of mission is the force commander. The others have force commanders and head of missions. What are their roles? Because I have seen a host nation where it has told a delegation that your mission should leave because you are not doing what brought you here. What brought you here is to engage the negative forces. But when you look at the mandate is not saying that. The mandate does not allow you to go into fighting. But the host nation is expecting you to do that, the host nation government. Now, this takes me to misinformation, because the host nation is saying we must fight. The population also says you must fight. So as you leave the capital, where the government says you must fight or you leave, the population stones you. This causes insecurity to the forces you are going to deploy because of misinformation. You are talking of misinformation maybe in the society, but there is misinformation of the leadership. The host nation has a role to tell its people that the mandate of this mission does not allow them to fight. If they don't inform the people, then the people turn into a hostile society against the peacekeepers. We have seen this. Some of the missions that are closing, it's not after satisfactory performance. It is because the host governments say we are not doing what they want us to do, instead of informing the population that we are doing what we are supposed to do only. So this kind of information requires, how do you in New York with your representatives in the missions, how do you engage the host nations to clear this? That's why I said maybe it goes to Madam Moderator. Now, if that is not done, you in the mission area, what do you expect? A hostile environment, because you are not doing what they want to do, and it is being echoed by the government. So, well, when I put this together, I therefore realized that we need to do more at different levels. Strategic level, the highest level of the UN with the host nation. You need to get the information down clear, so that the government also disseminates the correct information down to its people, and then we have our working environment as I mentioned before. Thank you very much.
For the questions that have been raised. I'll start briefly with the question that our colleague from Pakistan asked about the required capabilities and missions. There's a couple of points I'd make there. I think, first of all, it is very context specific in terms of the types of capabilities that might be required either in the uniformed or the civilian component when it relates to responding to mis and disinformation or the role of strategic communications there. And I guess to stress there that it's a shared responsibility as well. I think one of the areas that is being explored in the lead up to the Peacekeeping Ministerial is what skills and competencies do different uniformed personnel perhaps need in missions to respond to this evolving threat environment at present. And I note that simply not just in the context of peacekeeping. This is something that national militaries, police, governments and a range of different services are grappling with at the moment as it comes to the evolving information environment, the threat of mis and disinformation. So I think that is I would imagine sort of a core part of that conversation is what is the required training, what can member states offer around those things if they do have training and capacity building programs, how can those lessons be shared, and I would add in there, what does that look like in terms of the role of engaging with the civilian component in the mission as well. So I won't speak necessarily to dedicated capacities of missions. I think obviously that's quite context specific, but I think those skills are quite essential, and not just for the uniform component, but for everyone working in the mission setting to understand what this looks like and how it impacts their role in implementing the mission mandate. Very briefly, we had a comment from our colleague from Nepal regarding some of the work happening on language competencies, which I think, given the panel that we just had on mis and disinformation and hate speech, is particularly important. When you consider that understanding the local context, understanding how language and different words are used or perhaps weaponised is really essential. And so therefore ensuring not only there are those language competencies that might be among different personnel that are deployed, but that you are working with different members of the local community and population to understand that information landscape and that environment is absolutely essential. And briefly, you also made a comment, I think, on the role of females participating and their deployment and engagement with local communities. I think I would add in there, I think it is the participation of both women and men that we see jointly deployed that bring those combined skills into those mission settings that I think is so essential. So I think it's also that combination that is really important in terms of the different skill sets and ability to engage with communities as well. And that is something that we have seen quite useful progress take place within peacekeeping settings over the last 2 decades or so in particular. Very briefly, for our colleague from Uganda who mentioned some different comments there around host nation government expectations and requirements on the ground. I think this is a really critical area when it comes to expectations about protection of civilians. We are seeing play out pushback around the role of protection of civilians in some peacekeeping mission mandates. I think if there is a threat to civilians on the ground or a need, this sets up a very important conversation about what the role of peacekeeping is in these settings, whether peacekeeping is the right tool, what that relationship looks like in terms of the host government's understanding of that, in terms of the needs as well, noting that they do have responsibility for that, notwithstanding there may be some limitations on that as well. So I think it's a very important point, and I think even a more important point when we reflect on why peacekeeping missions have the mandate they do. And part of that is because of the developments that we saw play out here nearly 30 years ago in terms of the inability of a peacekeeping mission to respond when there were significant expectations that they might be able to intervene when civilians were under significant threat. So I think understanding collectively what role do we see for protection of civilians as a core part of peacekeeping where civilians are under threat, and if peacekeeping isn't a tool where we have collective consensus to deploy in those environments, you then have this conversation that we see and has been framed a little bit in the new agenda for peace around what is the role of peace enforcement? What is the role of regional peace support operations? Can they do things in a security environment that peacekeeping can't do in these contexts? So I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you, Lisa.
Okay, it's very interesting to hear the comment from the participants. And some of the participants coming from the military uniform personnel. And I think according to our experiences joining with the peacekeeping missions, there is a gap of communication, especially come up between the uniform personnel with the civilian personnel in the peacekeeping missions. And in those gaps has to be break up first because the gaps for the civilians, it was mentioned they are doing the negotiations, the political issues, but the military or the personnel, the police personnel, they are on the ground level, which they are directly involved with the public or the parties or the alliances who are in conflicting parties. So it's very difficult for them to communicate with the host member, the conflicting parties, if they know what is the politicians or the civilians take on the discussion or take on the negotiations. So in this regard, we would like to suggest that indeed we have to deliver all the critical information, not only to the individuals like military observers or individual police officers, but also to the troops until the low levels, yeah, that they know about the process of the missions, how is the progress of the missions, and what is the mandate is supposed to be done by them. Because, as already mentioned by our general from Ghana, there are big expectations coming from the host about the mandates, where actually the mandate is different with the expectation. Those gaps is coming to the troops or the police who are on the ground levels. And the question coming from the General Pakistan, I agree for the Indonesian peacekeepers, whether it is individuals or troops or police, we touch them with the specialist communicators, or even the specialists for what we call IT, who manage the communications level. But the problem is, in some circumstances, there is a one-way communication which is given or directed by the missions, that there are some do and don't for us to do these things. So with those all limitation of do and done, then we cannot the mission, the TCC or PCC get challenges on communicating with the locals especially. So I agree that I believe that every TCCs has equipped the capabilities or capacities for those who are going to be deployed on the mission with the capacity of communications. But as we know that we are coming from different countries, as we know that now there's about more than 80 PCCs or TCCs involving in the missions, which mean they are bringing their own capacities, they are bringing their own different skills or different backgrounds from its countries. So in this regard, I would like to suggest what we did or what we have been doing in police division. We believe that from those PCCs who involved with the deployment of missions, which they carry out the different policing, the different issues of policing, then we created on 2012 what we call as strategic guidance frameworks from the different kind of policings which conducted in every country, and then we created a strategic guidance framework which allow us doing this thing as SGB in terms of STM, specialists, and other issues. So why don't we create the strategic guidance framework for communications, which giving guidance for PCC and TCC to conduct the communication on the missions and deliver this SGF of communication to the TCC, PCC, and will be delivered during the training. I think this is from my comments for the. Yeah, enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, maybe I want to finish with a small comment on all what have been said. I think that strategic communication is very important for the missions, however, result of the missions, listening to the ground, listening to what people need, trying to help install the eco-social environment for the people to live in dignity. It's important and can help the spokesperson or the communication strategy to be successful, because if the mission is filling on the political, on other different fields that are very crucial for locals, any strategic communication will not succeed, because they will judge us on a result, not on words. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just a couple of very brief comments, I think in response to the contribution from the General from Uganda on how HQ, headquarters, also supports the missions in dealing with some of the challenges we have with the gap between the expectations and the mandates. Certainly, there is a lot of communication. First, working in New York with representatives, permanent representatives, also through very frequent visits to mission locations where we engage not just host governments but also host communities, civil society organizations in dealing with some of these perceptions about the mandate or perceptions about not being there to protect or to implement what they think we should be there to do. But clearly, I agree with you, there's a lot of work that we need to do on this aspect of communications, really on the issue of the mandate. And I also want to very much agree with the comments by the Nepalese delegate on language competency, and here I would like to add sensitivity to the cultural context. It's critical. I think that this is something that peacekeepers are pretty much aware of, and we need to sharpen those. And female peacekeepers having a good balance. I think that the trend suggests that TCCs are very much working towards this. This is very important because the women do play those critical roles, particularly in the communications at the local community level. Happily, there are the partnerships. I mean, I can talk about the LC initiative and other efforts to try to enhance the capacities within countries, member states, to be able to field more female personnel in this very critical area. So having said that, I don't know whether we have time to do another round. We do. No, we don't. So I'm not getting a nod from, so maybe on that note, and my apologies to those who have their hands up, maybe we can, in the break, just have some informal conversations amongst ourselves, but really to thank you all very much, particularly our excellent panel that has provided us with really lots of food for thought and practical, very practical suggestions and recommendations on how to effectively do the interplay between the protection of civilians, mandates, and also strategic communications. And thank you for your cooperation. Thank you.
Please join me once again to give a round of applause to our distinguished panel for a very good discussion. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the next item on the agenda is our closing ceremony, which will have closing remarks and a summary and conclusions of the 4 sessions that we went through in these 2 days. These remarks will capture quite a number of insights, a summary of insights for the Preparatory Conference of this 2023 Peacekeeping Ministerial, organized by Rwanda, Indonesia, the United Kingdom, and the Kingdom of Netherlands. Let me invite the first speaker to the podium to give his remarks. The first speaker is Mr. David Harry, who was, I think, on the first panel as a moderator, the Director, Division of Policy, Evaluation and Training, United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations. David, where are you? You're welcome to the podium.